end user-based authentication was kind of what was going to be needed because it would preserve security and permissions in downstream systems so that you didn't have to over provision an agent, because if you over provision an agent on a business system, it creates a risk where somebody who does not have high permissions but has access to the agent can now circumvent your security policies, which in our use case was a really big deal. But if you can authenticate as the user, then you preserve all of those policies. Now, we ultimately fixed that and realized that that was a bigger opportunity. So we started to focus the business there. And then what we discovered after that was that if you do end user based authentication, you unlock the ability for an agent to talk to a lot of other systems that it couldn't talk to before. The biggest example being email. And so now suddenly an agent can access email because it can now authenticate as itself, as the user, as opposed to as itself. So that's kind of our journey in the process. I'd love to hear what you guys have seen or what you guys are trying.
Can you tell a little bit more about the use cases, just to
Yeah,
get a little bit more practical insight of to how it works and what it unlocks? So
yeah. I'll give you the best example we have is like ChatGPT, right?
yeah.
Everybody uses ChatGPT. Everybody here has had ChatGPT draft an email for you, but you've never sent an email through ChatGPT. And the reason you haven't is that ChatGPT can't authenticate as you into Gmail. Now,
So the ideal persona could be a salesperson in a corporate.
it could be, yeah, it could be anybody. It could be, so yeah, like, we hear all kinds of use cases. So I'll give you a consumer use case, and then uh, I'll give you business use cases. So let's say we built a personal assistant agent. Everybody talks about personal assistant agents. Um, and you want it to tell you if you received an important email from your spouse, and to alert you if it does, right? Well, that requires the agent to access your email. And so when you ask it to do that, it's got to go hit Gmail, and so in the moment, it's got to go authenticate as you. Um, the other place, so let's say we got that working. Then you say, okay, cool. Hey, I'm going to go fly to Brussels. Can you please book me some airfare? Go buy me a flight. Um, on KLM. Um, it's the best way to do that is for it to log into your existing account on the airline and go purchase you the ticket, which it has to do as you. Um, go send a message on Discord, um, to tell my friends, in this Discord that I'm on, that I'll be at the event next week. Again, it has to authenticate as you into Discord to send that message. On the business side, it's a bit more powerful because of security controls in business. And so a really easy one is, a salesperson, right? Salesperson is about to walk into a meeting and they go, hey, I haven't done any homework about this meeting I'm about to go have. Can you please go give me all the information that I need about this account? And so it's going to go hit the CRM. It's going to go hit the personal email of that rep to go see if there's any, out of band communication that's not in the CRM. It might hit some public APIs or some private APIs to go pull additional enrichment data, and then pull all that together to present a brief to, short brief to the rep as they're about to walk into a meeting. But to do all of those, especially the CRM one and the email one, it needs to do it as the sales rep, because there might be information in the CRM that the sales rep does not have access to. So, if I'm the rep for Deutsche Telekom, and I ask a question about Deutsche Telekom, okay, great. I should probably have access to that. But if I'm a rep in the United States in a totally different industry, and I ask about the information at Deutsche Telekom, I probably shouldn't have access to that. And so it's too hard to do that if you don't have the agent acting on behalf of the end user. And the same is true for all kinds of other, business systems, SRE use cases, right? People spend millions of dollars on privileged access trying to manage who's able to get in. Financial systems, email systems, HR systems, all of that stuff today is structured around the access that an individual has. Drive, right? One of the big challenges with RAG systems, retrieval augmented generation systems, is that they're ultimately sucking all the data out of your file systems, like a Drive or a SharePoint or a OneDrive. And then they put them in their own repo. And then in their own repo, they're doing all the embeddings and vectorization and all that stuff. But in moving it out, they're stripping away all the permissions. And so that limits what you can apply RAG to, right? You can't apply RAG to the finance department in a publicly traded company, because then how do you prevent the intern from seeing the same information that only the CFO can see? But if you're able to preserve user-based permissions, then it's actually really straightforward, right? Only the CFO can see something and only the intern can see what the intern can see, because you're preserving what's already there as opposed to stripping it away. Is that helpful?
Yes. So you don't create a separate permissions and access layer. You just jump into the existing one.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've talked to a lot of RAG companies, and it's so funny. Technology changes overnight, right? And so what was state of the art yesterday now feels pretty old today. And when we talk to companies that are really focused on building RAG systems, they're trying to mitigate the problem that they inherited based on the architecture they chose. And so you see them putting in a tremendous amount of engineering effort and thinking around, okay, well, how do we mirror all of this complex authorization policy data for all the data we're collecting? Now, you might be able to pull that off if you're only collecting data from one data source. Like if you're just doing Drive or SharePoint, okay, that's feasible. But once you start to expand the number of things you're hitting, then it gets really hard because they all have radically different authorization policies. Like AWS's authorization policies are like, arcane and radically different than GCP, which is radically different and arcane compared to Azure. And they're all the same thing. And those are, and so then if you introduce like CRMs and HR systems and any other type of data sources, the problem statement for the engineering team trying to pull data from all these systems becomes extraordinary.
Well, that's really cool. And so your offering is basically to B2C, but also to B2B, just as the use cases you just described, or do you also license your technology to be part of a product?
Yeah, sorry, and this is not meant to be a product pitch, but yeah.
No.
So, our product is for developers, and so it is ultimately an API.
Okay.
That you bring in, and you just hook it up, and then you can build whatever you want. Our product is not for the end users; it's only for developers.
Okay, got it.
Well, I think Stephen had a question.
I don't know what questions actually. So thanks for sharing those insights. And I was taking up some notes here. And I think first off is really, I'm only getting started in the old tool calling area. So forgive me if my questions are naive. But I think that the first one is really on the guardrail side. So, no, before the guardrails, I want to think about, let's go back to how it's been done before. Because we wanted to go into the tool calling and sort of realize that, okay, is it in a sense that now you're mentioning that you want to ensure that the tool gets access as the user, not as like an external system, or how is this usually done before now or before like this kind of solution? And then secondly, what are the guardrails? Because, agentic systems could potentially go rogue, or at least maybe external factors, adversarial attempts against them.
Yeah.
What are guardrails that you sort of see in the industry that sort of helps with sort of ensuring that, the systems don't access more than
Yeah.
they should and all that. Yeah.
I
And
love
then I'll follow up questions later on.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great man. I love those questions. Those are fantastic questions. Let me play them back to you really quick so I can answer them in order. The first one is, how was this done before? Like how did people access, data or more specifically end user data before?
Yeah, how do they come to, yeah, essentially. Yeah.
And then the second question was, how do you implement guardrails so that the agent doesn't, accidentally delete your entire, file structure in Drive? So first question on how was it done before? It was scary how it was done before. So we were really, so I'm an authentication guy, and I did not set out to start an authentication company. I want to be really clear about that. I don't like the authentication space. It's very, very ugly. And so I was like, I'm never doing auth again. And as we were trying to build our own agent, we realized, oh man, this is really dirty. And this is really scary. And so I'll tell you what we saw. One thing we saw was people were using API keys. API keys are fine, but they were keeping them as environment variables in their server systems. Now, there's two problems with that. API keys are ultimately a bot account. And so you run into this problem where you over provision or you under provision the agent, but the agent only has one level of access. And so your power users are limited, and your least privileged users or your least privileged users are over, have more access than they should. The other problem with that method is that putting API keys in your environment variables on your server is the equivalent of you keeping your passwords and usernames in an Excel file on your laptop. And so if anyone broke into your server, they could just look at the environment variables and have access to your service. And so that really, that was the state of the art. And for most people, that still is the state of the art. When it came to end user based authentication, you're seeing the state of the art. The state of the art is Anthropic computer use, which is I'm going to go get on your computer and, control your browser so that I can act as you. That's a very niche use case, in our opinion. It doesn't work great for this kind of stuff. And so we, that is still kind of the state of the art until we took our approach, which is a bit more like developer centric and scalable. So the question then is, and to be clear, we're using OAuth 2 to make this stuff work, which is very hard to do in agents because OAuth 2 is a browser-based, web-based protocol, and agents are not browser-based or web apps. And so we had to do a little bit of engineering to get it all to hook up properly. The next, sorry, did we lose Stephen? Yeah, anyways, I'll answer the rest of this question anyway because it's a really good question. How do you handle guardrails? There he is. Yeah. Hey, Stephen. Welcome back. So the next question was, how do you handle guardrails? And that's a really good question. The way you handle guardrails in a product like this, well, one, I don't want to like minimize the responsibility that the developers have in building an agent. And so a lot of the guardrails are going to be on the developer building the agent to figure out like their own guardrail position. And so there's really no substitute for that. But from a tool perspective, you can add extra layers of protection by minimizing what's called the authorization scopes that the agent is going to have access to. So if you've ever, I'm sure all of you have done this where you've been working with a web app A and it wants to access Gmail, and you click a button and it sends you to a Google page and says, hey, do you want to authorize this other system to talk to your Gmail? And then it shows you the things that it's going to try and access. So, it's going to have access to your emails and your contact list and your first name and last name, and you get to say yes or no. That's called an OAuth 2 flow. What's happening when it lists out all those things that the app is going to have access to? It's basically defining the authorization policy of what the application can do. So the way you can implement guardrails is when you specify a tool in your agent. You should, and we make this possible in our service, but regardless of our service, you should define the scopes of what that tool should be able to do. So let's use a Google Drive example, which is a very simple one. You probably don't want to let the agent delete files. And so as you define your Google Drive toolkit, you would specify what tools, what scopes it needs in Google Drive, but you would omit deletion from there. And so anything else that you're nervous about, you would just not allow it to do. So even if the agent goes haywire and decides that it wants to delete the whole file structure, it can't because it lacks the permissions to do that. In the same way that you would treat an intern in an organization. Like the intern might be the nicest person in the world, but you don't know. And so you're going to take some precautions. And so they're not going to be able to access the quarterly financials for your business. Does that help?
Alex, and it leads me to a really interesting question. And if the agents are sort of accessing services as users, for instance, are you saying maybe like for a Google login, for instance, the authorization is directly to the Google account, not like you have to create like a separate account for it to sort of leverage or something. It's just through your Google account, maybe logs in, let's say Google sign in hypothetically, and then you only get to define those permissions on that of what it can access or what it can do and stuff. I think that's a
it's such a safer, and also it's easier for the developers. So it's kind of like a win-win. It's less work for the devs and it's safer for the user. And so the user has full access to Drive, but when you wrote your Google Drive connector, you limited what it could do in code, and therefore the agent can't go haywire.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And maybe I just drawing back. I'm just going to draw back briefly to our use case. And I did mention earlier we building this content platform out, and we actually started off as creative agents for AI startups, content creative agency. And one thing we sort of learned from folks that we talk to is being able to move like content from our platform to their own platform, like their content management system, or being able to pull in analytics. And I think that's one of the areas where we feel like tool calling will be really important for us. And just curious there, what types of authentication in this sense would you figure, okay, this is a third party product, and then there are like other, maybe companies leveraging it or using it and stuff. They're like, okay, it's not like a direct user to tool situation. It's just a three-way situation where there's this product, and then a user is using this product to sort of access their own CMS or access their own Google Analytics platform to pull in data and stuff. What type of authentication mechanism go in that three-way communication style stuff, especially when you have agentic systems doing the tool calling?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my mind, it's a pyramid. And so, of idealness, like what's ideal, what's available. Because one of the things that you're going to run into is, well, what does the target system support? So let's start with Google Analytics. So Google Analytics has a permission policy, right? Not everybody has access to everything Google Analytics. But the good thing as well is that Google has OAuth 2. And so for Google Analytics, I would absolutely do it as the end user, because then you're preserving the rights, the permission rights that customer has already set up. Now, this may not be a problem with small organizations, but if you go to a larger organization, they're going to care. And so if you do it via OAuth 2 at the end user level, then great. If for whatever reason Google offers it, but you don't want to, then you would have them create a bot account, which we don't recommend, but it is totally totally possible, and what is currently the state of the art. And therefore now your bot gets whatever access that the customer wants to give it. But that also means that every user you have is limited, no matter what their privilege level is. They're limited in scope to whatever the bot can see. So if someone's has less access than the bot, they've ultimately been jumped up a level. If someone has more access to the bot, they've been dropped down a level. But in some cases, that makes sense. So that's still OAuth 2 generally. Not everything supports OAuth 2, unfortunately. And so you drop down a level. Ideally, they support some sort of server to server communication, like in just simple HTTP auth. In which case you have basic credentials, ideally API keys in secret or something else, maybe password, username, and then you can have server-to-server communication. That's the equivalent of a bot account. But in many cases, it's a bit more dangerous because those tend to have super user access. And so you're giving your agent full access to the service, which may not be what you want, especially if you have end users interacting with your system, because we can worry all day about what the agent wants to do, but we should be much more worried about what the end users want to do. And then if you go a level down from there, if there are no APIs, there is no server-to-server communication option, then you drop down and you have to start doing browser scraping, where you're detecting the login screen, you're injecting credentials, and then you're going to the next page and you're like scraping that page and determining what's happening in the code, and that works too. That's hard. The biggest problem, there's a lot of reasons why that's really hard, but the biggest one is that it's very brittle. If the target system changes where the buttons are, your integration breaks.
No, that makes sense. And I'd love to give room for others to sort of ask their question. But I think my final take really is on I think recently Foundation Capital published a really interesting article on, service as, software and agents and all the stuff. I really love to get your take on that, and where you sort of headed with agentic systems. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read the paper, but I'm happy to give you my very quick dissertation, very quick, on software and where agents are taking it. I'm a purist. If I bring everything down to like basic principles, all software is ultimately workflow automation, right? And that's all software has ever been, right? From the Enigma systems back in World War II to Netflix to agents, right? At the end of the day, they're all automating some workflow, whether it's cracking a code or getting you your Netflix show to watch, or booking you travel for what you want to do. And so when I think of agents as just another iteration on workflow automation, to me, the big fundamental change that's happened between where we are today and where we were just 2 years ago before GPT 3.5 came out is that large language models got really good at reasoning. And so most software up until 2 years ago was basically just really fancy if-else checks and very deterministic if-else checks. If this user, bam. If this permission, bam. If this input, bam. And the thing that fundamentally changed was, if you think of a workflow diagram and you've got the little decision point in the workflow diagram, that decision point became less of a basically a string check or a number check, a very simple Boolean, and it suddenly became a very sophisticated statistical approximation system. And that meant that you could now ask your workflow automation system to write you a poem. And it could do it with very few steps. If you had tried to do that with traditional deterministic software, the combinatorics would eat you alive. You'd be writing code, to the day you died. But now you can ask it to write you a poem in one line of code, and you're done, because that if check, if you will, has become extraordinarily sophisticated. It's come at a cost because it's probabilistic instead of deterministic, and so it can be wrong often. But the power of what it can do when it's right is world-changing. And so now the work is on the rest of us to mitigate, those limitations so that we can apply that power to use cases that were combinatorically impossible 2 years ago.
That's very cool. I have just one short last question, maybe. Is your service limited to any? So you use Google a lot in the examples, but is it limited to any services, or is it as broadly as you want?
Yeah, great question. And I'll answer it before we jump over. It's not limited. We have pre-built tools like Google and Slack, and that list will continue to grow. But we also have an SDK that you can use to build whatever you want. And the SDK is really powerful because it's going to take care of a lot of the underlying guts that if you're not an expert in tool calling, you don't want to deal with, like retry logic and scaling and all that stuff. But one other thing that it includes, which is a really big deal, we talked about like because you're introducing non-determinism, the AI can mess things up. That screws up how you do your testing. You can't write pie tests. You can't write normal tests to see if your tool calling is working. And so our SDK also comes with an eval framework for determining how well your LLM and your tools are interacting with each other. See if tool selection and parameter guessing are working properly.
Nice.
Really amazing. Yeah, thanks a lot for all the insights.
Yeah, no, I appreciate all the great questions. Thank you so much. Well, I think we have to jump over to the live session, but it's a pleasure to meet you all.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. I'll
Thank
connect
you.
with you on LinkedIn. Cheers.